of mine, the Reverend Elizabeth Wynn. It's titled, For When I Really Don't Want to Learn This. God, Spirit, I really would rather not learn this. Didn't think I needed to. I thought someone else could do it, thought a leader was coming to do it, thought the young people or the elders would do it, or maybe the professionals. Or I don't want to learn it because it means letting go of something that I hold dear. Letting go of being someone who knows the answers. Letting go of being someone who doesn't know. Letting go of the way I see the world. Letting go of how I might have to change. Letting go of certainty, of logic, of facts, of control, of the myth that you can live on this earth and not harm, or the myth that I can't learn anything new. Help me, God, to learn it, please. And then help me to live what I have learned and do right by the gift of being taught. Blessed be. It was New Year's Eve, and I was preparing for a round of progressive New Year's Eve parties, Zoom style, of course. If you've never been to a progressive dinner party, well, it's when a group of friends gather for an evening of good food and desserts, with each course being served in a different home. Even though I certainly love my friends, I have to say, contemplating a 6-hour gathering on Zoom at the end of December, you know how exhausting that could be just to imagine. But I love my friends. So as I prepared to swoosh from Dallas to Philadelphia to New York City and then back to my COVID home in Oklahoma City, I decided that I needed to have some private time, time to reconsider the last year. The death of my brother from COVID, an uncle from lung cancer. I needed to consider the toll one carries when every announcement of a friend or student or a family member is something about their COVID status and how they were dealing with it. And then there was a big move where I had to shut down a house and move 800 miles to our historical family home. Nothing last year was easy. My response, my spiritual practice, like many of you, I suspect, was to take a nice long hot bath, to recall each of those events, and then somehow or another in the spirit of that time to wash them all away. After I did 20 to 30 minutes of reflective prayers surrounded by the requisite candles and soft music, I got out of the tub and I pulled the plug. I was feeling good. But within seconds, all of that would change because nothing happened. The water refused to drain. What an appropriate final insult to that god-awful year. I just couldn't believe it. As I stared at this dirty bathwater, I realized that letting go of 2020 was not going to be as easy as I thought. In the words of the poem, I really didn't want to learn that lesson. Though I can now look at this bathing adventure through more of a humorous lens, this story says a great deal about my talk this morning. Needing to learn how to let go of things we'd rather hold on to. Reverend Elizabeth offers, I really would rather not learn that. I don't think I needed to. I thought somebody else was going to do it. Someone else is always more prepared, more ready for that kind of work. What happens if I have to let go of something that I hold dear? I suspect I'm not the only one in this room that feels this way. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to let go of parts of myself that frankly, I've spent a lifetime learning how to protect. James Baldwin famously wrote about what it means to pay the price of the ticket. For me, as a scrawny Black gay kid from Oklahoma, whose middle school and high school years were basically centered by music lessons and libraries and singing in church choirs, I learned early on what it meant to pay the price of the social ticket. My family was one of the first 5 Black families to integrate our white neighborhood, which meant that I was attending white junior and senior high school, and then a white private college, and ultimately having to wrestle with the pinnacle of the academy, a doctoral program in philosophy at an Ivy League university. These are not bad places, but there certainly was always a racial tax that had to be paid. It was more oftentimes than I wanted to admit. There's so much more to this story, but I only have 20 minutes to spend with you this morning. But Reverend Elizabeth's poem came flooding back into my spirit last week as I sat in shock and disbelief, not surprise, but shock and disbelief at the civil evilness that unfolded on the steps of the US Capitol. I thought to myself, God, sweet God, why is my educator self being called into consciousness? Why do the events of my life keep pulling me into the middle of this morass, this civil dumpster fire, this deep well of disrespect, of moral depravity, of insolence? Dr. King warned us what would happen if society kept focusing on things instead of people. The historian Lisa McGeer wrote in a New York Times article last Thursday about our nation's long history of flirting with elitist ideas that demean the humanity of others. Nativist ideas like American exceptionalism, extreme polarization of groups, truth bashing, white nationalism, xenophobia, transphobia, anti-democratic policies, and so forth. Maybe you know and follow the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, on your TikTok. Maybe you follow her on your TikTok app, right? If so, you heard her say, and I quote last week, she said, "It's been an epiphany for the world to see that there are people in this country led by this president who have chosen their whiteness over democracy." She concluded, that's what this event is all about. The choosing of whiteness, of power and things over people and relationships is at the core of Dr. King's vision of beloved community. Interestingly, I think he would want us to pay attention to the moral center of our commitment to just thinking and living, but I think he would also want us to not be so arrogant as to not seek common ground. Dr. King's daughter, Dr. Bernice King, noted also on Thursday last week that this kind of approach is the kind of work that we must do. Quoting Dr. Bernice, to seek understanding from those with whom you don't agree, even those who are radically different. The call to find a connection that humanizes us. It is only then that the healing power of God's grace and love can work its magic. I recall when I taught in a professional development program for public school teachers in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, I was assigned to a white high school basketball coach. During one of our classes about doing research on student learning, he started bragging about his research project that was in reality highly unethical in how he was treating his Black athletes. Needless to say, I was seething. I wanted to create distance from him as much as I could. I marked him as an awful human being, and believe you me, I had lots and lots of data to support that. But it wasn't that I just didn't like him. As an African-American male, he surfaced negative experiences that I had with white males often, right? So it wasn't just about racial retribution of putting him in place. It was about protecting my 5-year-old Black gay self who was afraid to play sports with other boys in the neighborhood. He opened up a deep and tender place with me with just those activities, with just that kind of way of thinking. I built a wall. Yet, as the righteousness of my better angels spoke to my consciousness, the grace that wraps around a teacher's heart broke through my anger. You see, my educational theology says no one is ever beyond reach. By pressing into that touchstone, I found my way back into a professional relationship with that rascal. You see, I love data. And if I could turn him into data, something that I honored and respected, then I could listen and talk with him in a way that felt respectful for him and for me. I put learning at the center. I put his humanity and my humanity at the center. And it worked. As I was able to accompany him on his project, I could ask curious questions and prod him to rethink his faulty assumptions. It wasn't easy. Oh, it wasn't easy, but we got through it. I say all of this to note that justice speeches on Martin Luther King Day are fine, and I would say even appropriate and quite inspiring. But we also have to critique racist systems and faulty values. Yet our efforts should also pay attention to the hard and spiritually daunting work that teaching and learning for social justice inclusion, what it requires. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. As my introduction noted, I'm an academic religious educator. I create classroom environments designed to teach our hearts and minds, our spirits, how to expand, to make meaning of the ordinary ideas and experiences of our lives and turn those insights into something extraordinary, something useful, something that will compel people to be different, to be clear-eyed, to be more compassionate and inspired. That's what I want to talk to you about this morning. How can a beloved community respond to that impulse that says, I don't want to learn this thing. It is just too tough on me. How do we find ways to say yes to complicated teaching challenges, even when we know that it may stretch us as much as it will stretch our colleagues of difference? We know our moral and religious teaching say to love boldly, but what does it take to actually reach out across racial, cultural, and theological boundaries? Not to mention intersectional boundaries like connecting with transgender people of color or immigrants or people of color without access to wealth. And if you are a person of color, if you are Black, Indigenous, or from another people of color group, what will it take for you to cross a cultural boundary within your community? How do you navigate colorism? How do you interrupt structures, of male elitism, or issues of classism, or language, or body types? What would it take to reconcile with a religious tradition within your community of color, or from your particular ethnicity, one that's done you wrong? How do we make our rough edges smooth so we, in the words of Marge Piercy, can be of use? One of the wildly encouraging things that I have been learning from brain science is the realization that our brains have a remarkable plasticity to them. I grew up learning that you can't teach old dogs new tricks. Well, it turns out that wisdom was wrong. I believe that a lack of creativity and imagination are at the root of the hesitancy to reach out and engage. Let me tell you a quick story. About 8 years ago, I was invited by one of our African-American senior pastors to consult on creating a cross-racial dialogue in one of our largest Unitarian Universalist congregations. It seems that there was a deep and long-held assumption that the difficulties, as they politely call them, were the result of socioeconomic class differences, not racial differences. That's what they thought. So we needed a space to deal with those embedded ideas. I was invited to open up those spaces to explore how to systematically change that perception, rooted in fear, in shame, in guilt, and a lack of courage to take risks, to reach out beyond my friends, my colleagues, and my peers who I didn't want to appear ignorant in front of, right? I call this a creative experience, beloved conversations, meditations on race and ethnicity. And today, in this season of a global health pandemic, we had to move out of our brick and mortar shapings, right? Into an online learning community, which we are so pleased that it's actually working. It's a lot of fear that we had to face in order to get it from a brick and mortar setting into an online format, but it's happening and it's working. So I created in this new curriculum some basic foundational strategies, some things that we needed to do. It was a sort of a fusion of small group ministries, of summer camp wisdom, arts-based learning, theater, and exercises based on the work of Paulo Freire and his colleague, Augusto Boal. My goal was to find that sweet spot that feels both scary and interesting at the same time. I began fusing together strategies that promote transformational learning. They included a strong critique of how white supremacy culture warps most of our educational practices, how the struggle for efficient learning about racial and ethnic culture is crammed into learning containers that are far too small and far too simplistic to actually make a difference. I also designed to counter practices of perfectionism and overemphasis on logic, intellectualism, and dualistic frameworks that promote the idea that everything is either this way or that way, as opposed to an either or approach. My second strategy was to deal with the role of emotions in cross-cultural settings. I've got colleagues who teach about global theological diversity, and I was really surprised when they began teaching me that only about 20% of their courses is really about content. The other 80% of the work is actually helping people navigate their emotions, how they feel about the matter, the shame and guilt that they must confront as they realize their perspectives were narrow and were often hurtful. Wow. As a teacher, that is so counterintuitive, that it was stunning to me. After all, we spend huge amount of time creating book clubs and watching films, doing trips to museums and the like. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that content is not important. Rather, we must open up our spaces around those content-rich experiences for people to make meaning out of the content. So in my own family example, I can learn a lot and have learned a lot by reading books like Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. It's one of the latest hits of our multicultural, multiracial catalog these days. It's important to know, yes, the foundation of race in the United States, the conditions under which my great-grandparents immigrated to an all-Black town in the early 1900s. But the real work is figuring out how the racialization of my mixed race family, which included my white skin, red-headed, green-eyed grandfather who married a native Black woman, right? How that union created generational, emotional dysfunctions around who had value in our family and who didn't. Opening that door had huge and deep consequences of how I was able to understand myself and how I was raised and how I then treated other people. You get the idea of what I'm talking about here. The third area of focus is aesthetics. And by that, I mean having experiences that call learners into the realm of their imaginations, where learning experiences take on a visceral quality, something that digs into the bones, that shakes people, that haunts them well past the end of their time together. There's so many ways that teachers and facilitators can do this. My students tell me all the time that they don't understand what's happening, but they remember things that stick from my classroom experiences and workshop experiences. For example, I teach a course about human development and race. And our multiracial group of students, they travel from all over the world to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and nest themselves in congregations and city museums about the 1923 riot. The race riot. I asked students to bring a photograph of one of their family members who was alive in 1923. And I take them through a process where they create a dialogue between that particular family member in 1923 Tulsa. I'm consistently surprised how this simple exercise troubles a family's story about who they are and the decisions that they made and continue to make today. This exercise asks them to turn something that is quite familiar and make it strange. It becomes transformative. And finally, I'd like to talk about the role of a commitment to stay together, what we call in my community, a covenant. In the most simple of terms, a covenant is a public conversation of how we agree to be with each other. We consider language, we consider our bodies, our histories of marginality and mattering, all in anticipation of the ways in which human beings tend to disappoint each other. We are real. Maybe my community is different than yours, but we see all the time, we see what I call identity ambushes, all in the name of social interaction, right? There's a tendency to participate in one some people call a calling out culture, where bad behavior or thoughtlessness is publicly critiqued. The problem here is that when people are shamed into right relationships, they turn inward, they turn harsh. In a covenanted community, we agree to operate in a calling in culture, where we notice ways that we can be hurtful. Certainly, we do that. But we do so in the context of calling people back into our shared agreements, back into human relationships of love and compassion. We're not perfect at it, but we work on it intentionally. Each of these ideas requires a bit of mindfulness, a bit of serious work. I would encourage you to think of beloved community as a learning laboratory, where imperfections and mistakes and do-overs are a normal and celebrated part of the culture. My good colleague, Dr. Sharon Walsh at Meadville, says all the time, it's not about if I mess up, it's about when I mess up. Does your community tell stories about learning spaces that are designed not to be competitive, but spaces where people are intentional and searching for opportunities to heal old emotional wounds? To help people know that regardless of the skin that you're in, or the language that you speak, or the God you worship, that you are loved, that you are not alone, that you have value. The culture of our sacred structures, sadly, they often don't do practices that help us to live into these kind of possibilities. And we must figure out how to be intentional about that. What would it take for you to be part of the solution, even if it's only in small increments? What if our practices included falling in love with the messiness that is part of what it means to be human? So as I close, I invite you to think about how your practices uphold your values. If you believe everyone should have a voice, when and how do you make space for all those voices to be present? Do you schedule meetings during the day when people aren't available because they have to work multiple jobs? Do you provide childcare and translation services for non-English speakers? You get the idea. Are you actually literally practicing in ways that make people feel human? My hope, my prayer on this opening season of 2021 is that when you drain your bathwater, perhaps more will be drained than stays in the tub. When your head says, nah, I don't want to learn this, do yourself and your beloveds a favor and listen this time with your heart. Blessed be, Ashe, and Amen.